Daniel didn't sleep that night. He had returned home in a fog of adrenaline and unease, the digits still etched into a torn piece of paper now pinned beside his board. A patchwork of notes, photos, transcripts, timelines. The phone call hadn't answered much, only increased the pit of curiosity growing in his gut. He sat at his desk, the light of his laptop screen flickering against the dark window beside him. Files sat stacked like secrets waiting to speak. But it wasn't until the next day that he would finally hear what the box had been protecting.
Welcome to Echoing Tales, where horror lingers and mysteries whisper. Subscribe for chilling stories, true crime, and the eerie unknown. Now turn down the lights and let's step into the story.
It arrived in the mail, no return address, just a small manila envelope, padded, weathered. Inside, a USB stick and a typed note, and signed. If you're going to tell a story, Daniel, tell all of it. He plugged in the drive. A folder blinked open. Hundreds of files. Spreadsheets, bank transfers, encrypted PDFs, screenshots of private communications. One word stood out again and again. Orex. Alongside it, foreign corporate entities, routed transactions, duplicate identity strings, and more damning than any of it, tags that showed connections to civilian data pools. Financial information of ordinary citizens siphoned and sold, masked under aliases. Daniel scrolled faster. Their data was being cloned, identities duplicated, and bank accounts slowly drained through shelled debit cards overseas whilst the victims just saw it as a raise in tax. His hand hovered over the mouse. The scale was terrifying. Every page was a new confession. He opened one file. A list of names. Some redacted, some exposed. Most of them average citizens, but a few officials. Private deals marked as tax benefits. Massive withdrawals redirected into dummy corporations. He paused on one. Langston. Another. Holloway. Two names whispered in Margaret's final recording. Daniel closed his eyes and let the weight of it sink in. This wasn't just corruption. This was theft, global, targeted, and silent. He reached for his phone. 2 days later, in the echo of a glassy building in Midtown, Daniel stood in front of Chancellor Langston's private office. Langston had agreed to see him. Barely. There had been hesitation in his voice, the sound of someone who knew exactly why this visit was happening. Inside, Langston was poised, hands steepled on his desk. "You've been busy," he said without looking up. Daniel didn't answer. He placed the USB stick on the desk. "Tell me what you know." Langston looked at it for a long time. "Where did you get this?" "Does it matter?" Daniel asked. Langston exhaled slow. "You think this is a story? It's more than that. You knew what Oryx was doing. You let it happen." Langston smiled without humor. "You don't understand the game, Mr. Marin. If I don't play, someone worse does. And Margaret." Langston's eyes flickered. "She made a mess. Something that couldn't be easily cleaned, and she paid for it." The silence stretched long. Daniel stood up and left without another word. A day later, he was in a quiet part of town outside a modest apartment complex. Holloway's. The man had been a ghost since the news broke about Bryn's disappearance. No official appearances. No press statements. But he answered the door when Daniel knocked, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. "You have a minute?" Daniel asked. The door stayed half closed, but eventually Holloway let him in. The inside of the apartment was sparse, the blinds drawn. Daniel didn't waste time. He laid the printed files he brought across the coffee table. Langston's one thin ice. Now you can either join him or come clean. Holloway's eyes flicked to the documents, and then to Daniel. He said he'd protect us, that we were making a few risks for a bigger crash prize, that the money could be used to heal out country. Daniel didn't flinch. People's lives were ruined. You took part in allowing identities to be stolen, their money, hard-earned cash taken from them slowly without their knowledge, and it being blamed on taxes, and you convince yourself it was for the country. There was a long silence. Then Holloway said, "Okay, I'll talk." And he did. He spoke of Greaves, of how he built Orex from a legitimate institution into a private empire. He explained the foreign contracts, the laundering, the citizen data rerouted through silent channels. Of how Margaret had been getting close. How she'd almost found out where exactly the information was going. Holloway swore he didn't know what Greaves had done to her, but that after her disappearance, everything became more fragile. Daniel recorded the conversation. Every word. He was getting close. But Greaves was still out of reach. Until he wasn't. A few days later, at his apartment, Daniel received the message through a burner phone dropped outside his apartment door. One line. "You want answers? Come get them." A location. An abandoned airstrip, midnight. Daniel didn't go unprepared. He told Ben, told May, had his car parked facing the exit. Greaves was already there when Daniel arrived, alone, wearing a perfect black suit, standing in front of a sleek black car. His eyes were cold, assessing. "You've created a lot of problems for me, Daniel," Greaves said. "Well, when people start to disappear with no reason why, you start to question what their last moments were like," Daniel replied. Greaves shrugged. "They knew the cost. And you think I'll just walk away? No. Consequences?" Greaves smiled. "I know you won't." The hit came fast. Two men stepped from the shadows, grabbing Daniel. But he fought. Bit kicked, elbowed, and when one reached for his coat pocket, Daniel elbowed him, causing the man to let go. He slammed onto the gravel, through some of the men's eyes, and ran. Shots cracked through the night. He didn't stop until he hit the tree line. He just kept running. He made it home hours later, scraped and shaking. Ben patched his arm where a bullet had grazed him. The next morning, Daniel went to the police. They did nothing. The officer behind the desk barely looked up when Daniel presented the files. A glance, a shrug, and then a warning. "You don't want to get involved with these people." He realized then they were paid off. Everyone was. So Daniel did the only thing he had left. He gathered everything. The shredded paper trails, the archived audio files laced with digital grit, the overexposed surveillance photo with its ghostly silhouette, the broken testimony from Holloway, written like it had been squeezed out of a conscience barely holding itself together, and began preparing it all for release. One single upload, a payload of truth. A digital bullet aimed straight at the heart of a corporate empire, so large its logo appeared on city buses, building lobbies, and campaign podiums. He hovered his cursor over the publish button on an underground site dedicated to whistleblower leaks and tech gossip. The kind of site that lived in legal gray zones but still managed to terrify billionaires. His finger twitched. His jaw locked. This was the moment. He could see it. His hand shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. Then his phone rang. He didn't need to check who it was. It was his boss. "Daniel, stop." The voice was tight, rushed, almost out of breath, like it had been rehearsed and was now falling apart under pressure. "What?" Daniel barely whispered. "The board's threatening to shut us down. People are scared. Our advertisers are pulling. I've had calls from government reps. They're going to ruin us. All of us. I have evidence. I know. But if you push this, we all lose our jobs. Me. The interns. You. All for what? For a crusade that no one asked for." Daniel stared at the glowing button on his screen. The publish button. The line between before and after. "I can't lose this company, Daniel. I won't." The call ended, and Daniel just sat there, paralyzed, drowning in silence. The cursor blinked at him like a pulse from the machine, daring him to cross the line. But he didn't. He couldn't. Not when other people would lose everything for his decision. Not when Greaves had orchestrated everything so carefully, so insidiously, that Daniel's only two options were to be the hero no one would thank or the scapegoat everyone would blame. Slowly, hesitantly, he closed the window. He couldn't risk it. Other people were bleeding because of him. Greaves had done it. He had won, not with violence, not even with money, but with fear, pure, surgical fear, the kind that silenced rooms and made principled people fold like paper. The next day, Daniel was back at his desk, typing a small, inconsequential story about a rise in local farmers' market scams. Moldy peaches, fake organic labels, a vendor who had used laundry detergent to fake blueberry juice. A nothing piece, the kind of writing that filled columns and killed time. He filed it, got it published, closed the tab, and walked home, defeated, unnoticed, forgotten. Weeks passed, time blurred. The days spilled forward like water across linoleum, directionless, cold, impersonal. Daniel woke up, went to work, wrote meaningless fluff, went home. The passion he once had felt like it belonged to someone else entirely, someone younger, someone foolish enough to think the truth still carried weight. Eventually, the story faded, like everything does. Langston vanished. No press, no photos, no answers. Just a man erased from the record. Holloway resigned quietly. No investigation, no arrests. A new job overseas, maybe. A pension still untouched. And Greaves? Greaves smiled on magazine covers. He shook hands with senators. He unveiled new Orex prototypes on live streams with bright white backdrops and easy slogans like frictionless futures and data with dignity. He was untouchable. He was thriving. Then, one random morning, Daniel was awoken by a knock. Not a call, not an email, not a threat. A knock. Early. Maybe just past 6 a.m. The sky was still pale with sleep, the streets empty. He shuffled to the door, rubbing his eyes, barefoot, heart skipping the way it always did when the unexpected arrived. No one stood there, just an envelope, no return address. Inside, a single photo, a cabin, old, crooked, swallowed by evergreens and fog. Its wood was dark and weather-beaten, warped by years of rain and silence. The roof sagged under the weight of moss and time. The porch tilted slightly, as if bowing to the forest. One single window stared out from the side like a tired eye, glass cracked in a corner like a frozen tear. It looked like the kind of place forgotten by maps, ignored by memory, ignored even by the forest that wrapped around it like a cocoon. No coordinates, no note. But in the distance, Daniel saw a sign, blurry, small, barely readable. He held the photo under the lamp. The words formed like ghosts coming into focus. Camp Withergreen. His gut twisted. He knew, deep down, with total certainty. This was important. More important than anything in weeks. He opened his laptop, did the research. An hour north. Rural. Forested. Remote. Without packing, without thinking, without telling anyone, he grabbed his keys and left. The drive was long, winding, quiet, roads that narrowed until the trees scraped the edges of his mirror, branches clawing at the sky like dark fingers trying to pull the car off the pavement. The world outside his window grew stranger the further he went, the dense forest swallowing the sun, shadows pooling like ink beneath ancient trunks, until the edges of civilization slipped away entirely, leaving only the wild and the forgotten. The air itself seemed heavier here, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, as if the forest breathed around him, watching. Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His mind raced through every possible outcome, but there was no turning back now. Just when the urge to give up and turn around clawed at his resolve, the sign appeared, weathered, chipped, and faded by years of rain and neglect, yet unmistakable. Camp Withergreen. It stood there like a relic, a whisper of some older time when laughter once filled these woods and fires burned beneath the stars. The cabin loomed just beyond the sign, exactly as it had in the photo, Crooked and worn, the wood darkened by endless seasons of rain, moss clinging to its sides like the slow spread of time itself. The roof sagged unevenly, as if bowed beneath invisible burdens, windows staring out like tired, watchful eyes. This place did not belong in a modern world, but here it was, stubborn and silent, a secret waiting to be uncovered. Daniel parked a few feet from the porch, heart hammering so loud he was sure the forest could hear. He pulled his keys from the ignition, held them between his fingers like a makeshift weapon, something solid in the face of the unknown. His boots crunched softly on the gravel as he approached, every step heavy with tension and anticipation. The porch groaned beneath his weight as he reached the door. A long, slow creak announced his arrival, the sound scraping like fingernails on a chalkboard, breaking the suffocating silence around the cabin. The smell hit him first, stale and damp, the bitter tang of mildew mixing with dust, and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron or forgotten blood. It clawed at his senses and made his stomach tighten. Inside, the dim light barely touched the corners of the room, but it was enough. There, tied tightly to the bedpost, fragile and pale but unmistakably alive, were Margaret Elwood and Bryn Havers. Daniel's breath caught, heart stuttering, and then crashing back like thunder against his ribs. Time fractured. Instinct took over. He sprinted forward, fingers fumbling at the knots, whispering apologies, disbelief, desperate questions into the hollow quiet. They said nothing. No words. No movement beyond slow blinks. Exhausted shadows of the people he once knew, hollowed by something too deep for language. He helped them up with gentle urgency, guiding their weak bodies toward the door, urgency overriding hesitation. Outside, the forest stretched wide and indifferent. He eased them into the car without waiting for explanations. The drive back was a heavy silence, broken only by the flood of Daniel's questions, desperate to fill the void. "Are you okay? How long were you there? Who did this to you?" Margaret stared out the window, her eyes glassy and distant, while Bryn closed his eyes, lips pressed tight in quiet resignation. Their silence weighed heavier than any answer. Finally, Margaret's voice cracked, barely a whisper. "Can we go to my house?" Daniel nodded, no questions asked. She said she needed to retrieve something. He didn't press her further. He just drove. Days later, the moment arrived. The press conference. Oryx. Greaves. Flashbulbs exploding like gunfire in a silent war. Suits crisp and smiles polished to a lethal gleam. Rows of investors, employees, government officials, a parade of power and influence gathered under one roof. Even the Prime Minister was present, here to champion innovation, to shake hands, to secure re-election under the banner of progress. Daniel slipped in under the guise of a tech blogger, lanyard forged, hands steady despite the storm raging inside. Greaves spotted him instantly, the smile sharp, the wave casual, a silent message, still untouchable. But Greaves didn't see Margaret and Bryn, hidden in the back row, their presence like ghosts in the light. Greaves took the stage. His voice filled the room, smooth, confident, a practiced melody as he talked about biometric networks, cross-border digital verification, blockchain transparency, each phrase a calculated step in a dance of deceit. Then Daniel stood, slowly, deliberately, on his chair. "This man is a fraud." Gasps rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Whispers bubbled into murmurs. Camera shutters clicked like rapid gunfire. The tension snapped tight, like a rubber band stretched beyond its limit. Greaves laughed, low and mocking. "What is this meant to do?" "Scare me." The audience chuckled nervously, the fragile calm cracking. "You clearly have nothing else to do with your life, Daniel." So you make up stories to stay relevant. It's sad, really. You sold people's identities, Daniel shouted, voice raw with urgency. Greaves leaned forward, eyes gleaming. Prove it. Margaret rose. Her fingers trembling, she pressed play on her phone. The audio filled the room. Greaves, unmistakable, chillingly candid. You think Langston knows what he's doing? He's an idiot in a tailored suit playing chess with a checkerboard. He doesn't see the scale. None of them do. Look, selling the data wasn't the hard part. You'd be amazed how cheap identities are once you strip away the person. We mirror their details and give them to the highest bidder, and they never even notice. Most of them think they just overspent or were taxed. It's elegant. Silence gripped the room. Then chaos erupted. The Prime Minister stood, voice thunderous. Arrest him. Security swarmed, a tide of uniforms converging. Greaves tried to flee, desperate and cornered, but every exit was blocked, every route sealed. He was arrested, and days later came the trial. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. No polished suits this time. No practice smiles. Greaves sat in prison orange, hair flattened against his scalp, face pale, wrists cuffed to the chair like a man already halfway buried by his sins. Bail had been denied. The charges were too severe, the corruption too deep, the wounds too wide. The judge's voice was cold, final. You've been found guilty on all counts. Do you have anything to say before sentencing? Greaves rose slowly, every movement measured, deliberate. His eyes locked onto Daniel, then Margaret, then Bryn, a predator assessing his prey one last time. In the following week, the vast, tangled web Greaves had spun began to unravel, its threads pulled apart by relentless forces that exposed lies and corruption buried deep beneath layers of power and secrecy. Langston was found hiding in a safe house nestled in southern Spain and quickly brought back to face justice. His arrest sending shockwaves through political and financial circles. Holloway, however, vanished without a trace, officially declared a missing person, swallowed by the shadows he once inhabited. Meanwhile, international banks froze Orex's remaining assets, cutting off the lifeblood of the crumbling empire and signaling its inevitable collapse. Old victims stepped forward, their stories breaking years of silence, flooding the media with truths long buried and shaking the foundations Greaves had built. And Daniel? He returned to his desk, to the quiet rhythm of his job and the muted hum of the newsroom, where colleagues watched him with cautious admiration, some nodding quietly, others unsure of what to say. He sat, staring at his empty desk, the blank space a stark contrast to the storm he had just helped unleash. Then, slowly, he began to type again. A new story, simple and small, about a woman who lost her cat in a supermarket parking lot. It wasn't important. It wasn't explosive or investigative. It wouldn't change the world. But Daniel smiled because now he knew what to expect. And somewhere deep inside, he knew he would be ready for the next shadow when it came knocking. Thank you for watching Echoing Tales. Subscribe, ring the bell, like and share. Stay tuned, because the next mystery is already calling.